Okay, everybody, welcome to the first Renaissance Woodworker shop update live. Yay! Woohoo! All that fun, exciting stuff. So, if you're unfamiliar with Renaissance Woodworker, I'm some kind of weird woodworker that just likes to build stuff entirely by hand, with nothing but hand tools. I got a question from a listener, reader, viewer, whatever you want to call it, you guys that pay attention to this channel and to my blog. I got a question about cutting through tenons, but not just through tenons, but wedged or tusk tenons. And this is a gentleman that is trying to build, if I remember correctly, it was a crib, and he's using nothing but 4/4 stock. And that's a key point to think about here, because a lot of times when you're making that tusk tenon, you've got kind of a beefy tenon on the other side that you can drive that wedge through. So when you're working with 4/4 stock, you don't have as much material to play with, so you've got to be a little bit careful about it. So tonight I'm going to show two methods for creating that wedge, that tusk tenon, and how we can use one over the other when you've got particularly skinny stock to deal with, or how you can deal with typical 4/4 stock in order to go with the wedge approach that I think requires a beefier application. So it really will get you to the same place. I think one is slightly better than the other, and we'll kind of talk about that and contrast and compare each one. So what I've already done, I've got a piece of Peruvian walnut here, and I've cut two tenons on it. If you follow my Facebook page at all, I actually went live earlier today as I was cutting these tenons and talked a little bit about it. So if you haven't seen that yet, there's about 12 minutes of video of me sawing out these tenons from earlier in the week. Earlier in the day. I've got two pieces here that I'm going to mortise for the respective tenons, and I've got a little wedge that's already been mocked up, made out of teak, and I've got another wedge that I need to actually create. So first thing I'm going to do is cut the mortises. That makes the most sense, right? Let's focus on that first. So let's come a little bit close here and take a look at the bench. What I have is, move my wedge stock out of the way. I'm going to start first on this shorter tenon. And the first thing you have to think about when you're looking at making a tusk tenon like this is that the tenon itself is long enough. So this particular tenon, I'm actually going to be putting a wedge in perpendicular to the thickness. So it's going to go right up against that shoulder. So what I have to look at with the wedge stock is how much material am I going to have on either side of that wedge. And you'll notice I have not cut the shoulders, the haunches on the sides. I've left this tenon full width so that I can maximize the amount of material on either side of this wedge and the eventual mortise there. The other thing I need to look at is when this wedge is in place, how much tenon do I have on the outboard side of that? If it's too short, that end grain just won't hold it, and you'll actually blow out the end grain. So I like to have at least an inch outside of that wedge. In this case, I'm probably about 1.5. Yeah, about 1.5 inches, which makes the total tenon just over 2 inches, about 2.8 inches long. In this other instance, the wedge is going to be running through this way. And I haven't created this wedge yet, but it will be wedged down, so tapered, skinnier on this end, fatter up here. Well, when you've got it wedged through here, you still want to have a fair amount of material. Now, this is a particularly long tenon, but because now I've got, what, about 2 1/8 outboard of that. So I could probably cut this down even a little bit more, and I think having an inch, maybe a little more than an inch, would still be okay, but it's important to have that material on the outboard side so you don't blow that out. I just went ahead and cut a really massive, like 4-inch long tenon, because I actually kind of like the look. When you do a tusk like this and it slides through from the outside, I like to put like a decorative chamfers on the end. Maybe sometimes you can do like a little carving on the cheek here, which looks really, really cool, or you can do a carving on the tenon itself. Regardless, it's always good to have more tenon so that you can always cut it off later and trim it down a little bit later. The important measurement, if I were making a piece of furniture, is going to be this dimension, the shoulder to shoulder dimension. And all this out here is just kind of ancillary. So the rule of thumb certainly is to have at least an inch outboard of the wedge. But the key definer in this particular tenon, you'll notice this one is about a 1/2 inch thick. This one I've gone almost the full inch that this stock is. I just cut down tiny little 1/16 of an inch cheeks. I've got them over here still. I talked about this on my Facebook page earlier today about hanging on to these cheeks in case you ever have problems. You can always glue them back on. You get a good fit, but they also make really good wedge stock and things like that for later. So you see, I sawed off just these skinny little cheeks to create this tenon that is as thick as possible, because now I'm going to be driving a mortise through here, and I want to have as much wood on either side of this wedge as possible. This is just a 1/4 inch thick wedge, and if I had, say, a 1/2 inch tenon like I have here, well, that's a real problem, because I've only got a 1/16 of an inch material left, and that's just going to be really weak. Here, I'm going to have about 3/16 of an inch. It's going to certainly be a lot stronger and be able to resist. Not that there's going to be a lot of force against that, but you're just asking for trouble if it gets too thin. So that's the first thing to look at, how thick the tenon should be, and how long the tenon should be. As far as actually cutting and creating the tenon, that's really no different than how you would normally saw a tenon. And if that's something of particular interest, it's always something we can tackle in the future. So let's lay out this mortise. Just going to stick it right in the middle of the board. And since I'm just kind of cutting this in abstract, I don't really need to worry too much about laying it out perfectly centered and all that, because it's not hooking up to anything. I would probably pay a little bit more attention to all this stuff were in an actual piece of furniture. Right now, I just want to get it square to this reference edge back here. Now I can come in here, line that up. Fun. Darken this in. There's my mortise. So this is going to be a through mortise, which means I really need to transfer my lines around to the opposite face. So I like to use a saddle square for that. Makes it really useful, really easy rather. Got my knife in the line. Just put a little mark on the edge grain. Repeat that here. You can certainly use, a regular square for this, but the saddle square just makes things that much faster. So I've got those extents laid out. And I'll work with, you could use a regular gauge. I've got a mortise gauge here. And I'm just going to set the teeth on this gauge. This has got a little screw that adjusts the two teeth. Adjusted that, I'm in my lines, and it's tightened down the fence. Now I've captured this dimension. And there we go. There's our mortise laid out on the opposite face. Now in general, when it comes to through mortises, I actually like boring them out because I find that I can get through them a little bit quicker. But this is pine. And I laid out the tenon, I made the tenon thick enough so that it matches my 1/2 inch chisel. So it just makes it that much easier to go ahead and chop the whole thing out. Let's lock this down a little bit. So I'm going to chop approximately halfway through here. Moving in the direction of the bevel. Pine is really fun to horse. And I'll flip it around and put the chisel in the same strike marks, but the bevel running the other direction. I'm going to work my way back to my line here. And I stand back here so I can sight down and see that I'm square, with the chisel staying square. Just right my knife line. Make sure that we're straight up and down. And now, flip it over. Now I want to be a little careful on this side because there's not much wood here. And I could blow through really quickly. So I'm going to go light. See, I'm through right there. Go ahead and work right back to the line here. Okay, it's through there. I'm going to take my bevel back the other way. Didn't quite break through on this side. See, it certainly doesn't take a lot of effort to get through. There's just not much material there. Hopefully it goes without saying, but if you guys have questions, please pipe up. I've got the chat room running on my laptop over there. Well, I did have it running on my laptop. There it is. Peter's got a good question. Can you say something of the relative virtues of Tusk tenons versus drawboard tenons? Yeah, the first one is the Tusk tenon is a knockdown joint. You can knock that tenon out, that tusk out, and disassemble the whole thing, which is fantastic. I mean, that's really one of the primary reasons that we would do this, is for the knockdown joinery. Can't remember who said it. There's another question about chopping versus boring. I will be doing both. Specifically, I'm chopping this tenon, and I'll be boring the other one out. I'm going to drop my camera down a little bit here. get a better angle on the whole thing. Okay, let's go back to a close-up. So now, this tenon, you can see it came right through and I'm right on my lines. There's a little bit of fuzz in here, and a lot of that is because we're dealing with pine. You know, pine can be very soft. But I'm not particularly worried about that. I mean, I could come in and pair things a little bit, but certainly not the end of the world. The key is that I'm right on my lines, my knife lines. So if anything, I'll slightly undercut just to get some of the schmutz out of there. But here's the other wonderful thing about pine. It compresses a lot. So if my mortise is even a little bit fat, it'll go through there and compress nicely. Back up a little bit here. Very nice. It's a lot easier. Okay. There's a nice through tenon. You can see great shoulders. That's very nice. And then on the other side, the tenon juts through. I was going to say a little bit of a gap, but not really. It's a good fit. That's a through tenon to be proud of. So now, what I need to do is cut the wedge, the tapered mortise, to house this peg, tusk, whatever. And all I did here was I took this block, it's actually teak, and squared it up, turned it into surfaced on four sides, and I used my plane and just took a whole bunch of material off just with a jack plane right down here at the end. And then I started extending those strokes. So I took, like, we'll just say 5 passes from about, I don't know, an inch from the end. So starting right about here, I took 5 passes with the jack plane. Then I came back and took like 3 more passes, and going all the way to the end, and then backed up and took 3 more passes. And it's essentially flattening it out, but while I was doing that, I was actually introducing an angle. And it's very subtle, but, and that's kind of key. Let's just see. We are ½ inch at the thinnest part, and just over 5/8 at the thickest part. So it's a very, very subtle taper. But that's key. The more shallow that angle is, the more you're going to find that the tusk tenon, the wedge, holds better. If I made this at a 30-degree angle, that's an awful lot of strength that could possibly blow out the end grain, but it's also, you're forcing that tenon up a really steep hill. The more shallow it is, the more it's going to hold. And think about like a Morse taper on a lathe. It's a really shallow, tapered angle, yet it holds really, really well. So in general, I don't worry about measuring the actual angle. I usually will just create my wedge and kind of go from there. I'll show you kind of a slightly different way of approaching it with this wedge when I actually make that for the next example. So what I'm going to do now is set my wedge up against the outboard side here. And I want to mark the taper. So here's the thing. By marking the taper, I'm going to set how wide the mortise is up top and how wide the mortise needs to be on the bottom, and connecting those dots will give me that angle. So what I really want to do is set this in the position that I want it to be when it's fully seated. So think about, aesthetically, how do I want this to look? I mean, I didn't do a whole lot here. I cut a little V-groove, like a decorative edge, and round it over the top, and yeah, it looks kind of nice. I might do more to that. But ultimately, if it sits in this orientation, that looks pretty good. It's pretty even. So in general, what I do is I scooch it up just a little bit, so it's slightly higher than I want it to be, because over time it's going to sink down a little bit more. You always want to tap it a little bit more to bring it up really tight. So I'm going to even go just a little bit higher here. Set it right there. Now I'm going to trace, and you can see, hopefully you can see, the angle is now traced onto that board. So with a square, go ahead and take this out. It's a nice straight grain pine, so I want to be careful that I actually don't split this board. So I've got to be careful taking it out of here. Hi Dave, how are you? My name's Shannon. Thanks for subscribing. Yeah, I don't say that enough, do I? There's a couple questions about wood species here. Yes, this is just regular store-bought pine. In fact, leftover rock cuts from that bookshelf that I made a couple weeks ago. The tenon is Peruvian walnut, just a scrap that I had floating around. And the wedges are all made out of teak. If you've watched my channel, you remember I made a campaign stool a while back, and that's where the wedges come from, just little scraps of teak that were floating around. Species is kind of irrelevant, although I will tell you, pine is particularly soft for this application. It'll hold up just fine. I don't know how I feel about using pine for the tenon stock, though. The end grain might blow out a little bit more readily there. But species really shouldn't matter in this particular operation. I hope everything's sounding okay. I've had real technical gremlins with audio on YouTube Live lately, getting all kinds of static and stuff. I think I have unplugged everything that could possibly be unplugged in the shop. Fortunately, it's a hand tool shop, so there's not a lot that needs to be plugged in. But fluorescent lights, if I turn off my overheads, it's okay, but you're going to start to get real grainy real fast. So if I'm getting buzz from the fluorescence, I don't know what else to do about that. But man, it's been frustrating trying to figure out the technical stuff here and trying to get a good audio stream. All right, so what are we doing here? I need to transfer my lines all the way around here. So what we've got is the angle of the tenon marked out. I'm just using a fine point Sharpie because it stands out a little bit more. Probably not the most precise marking tool, but it shows up nice on camera. And then on the underside, square that across. You know what? It just occurred to me. I'm doing the wrong layout here. Getting ahead of myself. You moron. Oh, man. All right, guys. Let's put this back together. Unbelievable. I'm doing the other layout, which is meant for this tenon. Why didn't somebody stop me? Shoot. Well, there's a sneak preview of what's to come. All right, so this wedge is not going in this way, not this way. It's going in across the grain. So same thing that applies. I need to set it how I want it, in where I think it's going to look nice. And I'll back it out just a little bit. Whoops. About there. I will trace the angle. What a waste of time. I gotta hit this thing out. Good. Glad to hear the sounds good. Ken wants to know, does the tenon need to be really that tight? Honestly, it's not really that tight. I'm just being extra careful because pine is relatively soft. And if you look at this grain, you see how nice and straight it is? That is perfect for it to split along. And if I get too manhandling this thing apart, there's every possibility that I could split that out. So as you saw, I just applying hand pressure, I pulled it out. But as a knockdown joint, and again, that's why I would use a tenon like this, and probably why I wouldn't use pine. Every time you assemble this and take it apart, it's going to compress those fibers, and it's going to get a little bit looser every single time, which is why the Tusk tenon is so huge, because it will hold it tight for you. So yeah, it's good for it to be tight now, most definitely. All right. So let me transfer my lines across here. What I'm going to do, I'm just looking for not running my line all the way across the face. I'm just making a little mark to tell me now, it's a very subtle angle. So I want to capture that angle. Okay, so you see that? I now have captured this particular angle. And what I'm going to do is I'm not going to flip the board over because you tend to kind of get confused with which way the angle is running. I'm going to just bring the square down like that, so now I know that that orientation is correct. That way and that way. Good. So then I'll come over and transfer pencil line. There. That connects up. If I double check, this line that I just marked across, it connects up with the angle up here. So tracing this angle line, then squaring it across, setting the bevel gauge off that angle, and then just transferring it to the other side, and then connecting the lines, and I've got kind of affirmation that I did it right, because when I connect this line square across, it lines up with the initial line that I scribed. So what does that tell us? It tells us where we want to put the mortise. So now what I'm going to do is just come back in here and lay the wedge over top. Verify that that's square. Yeah. Because what I'm doing is referencing the top of this off my square shoulder. If this face is a little out of square, I could end up like tweaking it one way or another, and I'm not going to get it to line up just right. That looks about center. Then I'll grab my mortise piece, because I need to account for the thickness of the piece itself. What I'm left with, I realize my Sharpie is just not doing its job, so I realize it's a little bit harder to see. What I'm left with is a tenon. It's marked out here, and its location is set up. Now, I need to transfer that around to the other face, but here's what I want to do. This will work. This will, because of the wedging action of the tenon, it will come up tight. But I think what I'm going to do is stack the odds in my favor. Somebody mentioned draw boring before. Draw boring is based upon the principle that you offset the peg hole slightly, so when the peg goes in, it snakes around the offset and pulls it up tight. Well, I can do the same thing here, and I could set my line in. We'll go in 1/16 of an inch. That's what's kind of dull, so let's sharpen that up. The marking knife is a blue spruce marking knife. Very, very fine tool. I've used the Veritas one though too, like the $12 one. Great tool. Can't beat it for 12 bucks. So anyway, I'm going to go in 1/16 of an inch. Now I'm going to square that line across. And then likewise, I need to come down 1/16 of an inch on the outer edge of my mortise. This is just creating a little offset. Grab a marking gauge, and I'll set my gauge to the edge of that mortise. And it looks center, but I can't assume that it's center, so I've got to reset the gauge on this line. Transfer it around here. So on the opposite face, I now have my locations, and I need to square my new lines across. So technically, I'm duplicating my work here by putting these lines in twice. But it's important to see kind of, you can do it without the offset. It's perfectly fine. Now notice the back of this wedge is flat, so I can square that line across with just a square. I don't have to do any extra stuff there. This line. Trying to get my angle right. Okay. There's my angle. Set it on the new offset. I'll angle across. Square it across. I suppose I could use a knife. Probably should use a knife for that. The really cool part about this is a wedge that we're creating here, or will be inserted. So if the thickness is not quite right here, you just drive the wedge in a little bit more and it will fill in the gap. So what I'm left with is a mortise. And I'm actually going to bore this out. I don't want to be chopping through here. Well, or do I? So little wood. Now I'm going to bore it out. See if I got lucky with this bit. Oh, it's a bit too heavy. I thought this bit was going to be to work for the other mortise, but what is that, 11? So let's go to number 10. Oops, the wrong way. That's number 12. 10. Good. That's almost right. Boo, bad joke. Somebody just said this is the boring part. Now, here's the thing. I'm going to be boring through this, and I need to match that angle. So, the angle that I marked, I can clearly see it from my perspective as I sight down. I can see that it's leaning off this way. So I can just sight down the shank of my bit here. And sight down that. Careful. Here's another reason why having a little bit extra material out here is good, because an auger bit is essentially a wedge. If you're not careful, it will wedge your board right apart and split it. Probably could use a center bit here. That would do a better job than what I'm trying to do right now. Just feeling for the tip on the other side. I really need my shooting board right now. Just move that down and out of the way. Okay, again. Rock it just a little bit. Let those spurs cut through. There we go. On Facebook earlier today, I talked about hanging onto your tenon cheeks, because you never know when you might need them. Here's a good example. I can take my tenon cheek, slot it underneath here, and it will actually work nicely to kind of support my, my workpiece. A little bit of this waste in the middle. Now this back wall is straight up and down, vertical. So I'll do that one first. With this wedge, this method of wedging is a lot easier because you can see, because we've got such a small cross section here, the angle is really understated. You really can't see it. You can see it, but it's very minor. Take it easy on the chopping. This is not very thick. So you'll be surprised how quickly you can actually blow through the other side. Okay. Here, I've got so little wood, so little resistance. I'm just going to go right into my knife line and then through. That's where a heavier mallet like this Shenandoah 2 Works mallet is so nice, because if you've got a really wallop on it, there's every possibility you could blow through here and end up with a mess. Okay, now I'm going to set on my knife line, and again, like when I was boring, I can see my angled line that I cut with the bevel gauge. And I'm just going to angle my chisel, chop down. As I'm working across the grain here on the sides of this, I could just use hand pressure to work that down. I'm chopping the other way, the other angle. I'm leaning the handle the other way as I capture that wedging angle. And again, just pare away the sides. Got just a little bit. Make sure my corners are clean. Wedge goes through. Let's go through that way. There. So the wedge is now coming up tight, and you can see, I mean, that angle is so shallow that I wasn't quite sure which way it went through. But obviously, if it goes through the other way, you can see as it comes up tight, it's now at an angle to the long axis of my board. Now, where's my piece? Let's reassemble the whole thing. You can see already this piece has gotten just a little bit looser. It's not super loose, but now if I look, there is a very slight offset to this. See, the floor of the mortise is actually below the surface. And as I drive this wedge in, pulls the whole thing up really tight. You hear that pitch change, that tells you, yeah, it's firm. And that is wedged up. And this is great for, especially if, say, this were the stretcher on the bottom of the table and it was running in this orientation. This looks really cool to have that sitting out there like that. This will get a little bit looser over time, so you do want it sitting a little bit proud. If you have the luxury of checking on the piece of furniture, you know, if it's for your own house, if it's for a client, you can come back and check on it like a month later. You might be surprised that this will actually tap down a little bit more because it compresses a little bit over time. So right now, this is why I kind of stack it up a little. I'd like it to be a little bit lower, but I cinch it up just a little bit so that as this compresses over the next week or so, I can tap it down even a little bit more. I didn't do this with the through wedges on my joinery bench, which is where the camera is sitting right now. And they're tapped up tight, but there's only like a ½ inch of wedge above the tenon itself. I'm just going to have to make new wedges that are a little bit fatter, a little bit longer. But when I did this on my spring pole lathe, I specifically tweaked it up so it was a little bit higher. And then as they come up tight, I've still got a lot of wedge that I can tap. So as things loosen over time, I continue to tap the wedge, and I'm not running out of wedging action, I should say, to tap that through anymore. But the cool thing is just how strong that is and how cool looking it is. Nice tight fit on both sides, so you can see how that angle really does not have to be strong, but man, is it cool. It looks awesome. Justin wants to know, how long would this take if you weren't filming? Probably half the time. Half the time that it took to do this right now. Bob, do I prefer Jennings or Irwin pattern bits? Definitely Irwin pattern bits. I don't know so much about the clogging. Someone's saying that they clog a little bit less. Irwin bit, Jennings bit. The flutes are certainly wider open on the Irwin bit, so yeah, they're less prone to clogging. But I also find that they're a little bit easier to steer, if necessary, as you're making the cut. This kind of locks itself in, which you may think is a good thing. You may think it'll keep you straight, but it's really hard to get it perfectly straight when like only a ½ inch of the bit is in the cut. This gives you, the wider open flutes gives you just a little bit of flexibility to steer it a bit as you're sinking that hole. See if I've missed any other questions. Powermatic brace. Nice, Andrew. Yes, it's a Powermatic brace. It's powered by my Armomatic. Powermatic. Keats182 wants to know, what about seasonal expansion? Is there fear of it splitting? No. There is no fear of that splitting. Let's look about this. Where is this going to expand and contract? The mortise board is going to expand and contract this way, and there's nothing restraining that, nothing preventing that from expanding and contracting. It can do its thing. The tenon is going to expand and contract this way. So the only thing preventing that is the actual mortise walls themselves. And you're going to, on this width of board, the seasonal expansion contraction is going to be very minimal, but I also have ingrain backing it up and rather flexible board. So any movement, it's not an issue. I mean, it's not an issue when you put mortise and tenons together anyway, because that movement is so minimal, and there is some flex in the ingrain that allows that. The wedge is completely independent of that system. There's going to be no expansion and contraction longitudinally, or at least it's negligible if there is any. The only expansion and contraction from the wedge is across its width, but again, because it's so small, you're talking about a very small amount of movement, and there'll be a little bit of flex amongst the wood, but not that much that you have to worry about it splitting. But that's the other reason why I want to try to stack the odds in my favor and put some meat on either side of that wedge. You know, that's why I didn't cut the shoulders. This tenon is the full width of this board. There's a reason for that, because there's just less material. Timothy wants to know, how much wood would you leave between the mortician, mortician, that must be an autocorrect, the mortician and the end of the tenon. I talked about that right at the beginning, Timothy. I shoot for an inch outboard of the wedge itself. That's usually more than enough, and you can get away with a little bit less than that. But in this particular one, there's not that much wedging pressure, which is another reason why you don't want a super steep angle on that wedge. A really steep angle is going to exert that much more pressure as you try to drive that in, and you could possibly blow out the end grain. But if you've got yourself about an inch outboard of that, you should be just fine. I'm going to take this apart now. And again, you can see that wedge pops out, and I can take the whole thing apart again. So we have knockdown joinery that looks cool, is super strong, and it adjusts. If there is seasonal expansion and contraction, there's every possibility that the joint's just going to become looser. So you tap that wedge in just a little bit more, and you're good to go. So now I need to do what? I need to cut this mortise. Hey Brian, greetings from Bel Air. I'm just a little bit east of you. Dave is saying, do you have a formula for the size of the tenon and the meat needed around it? Dave, I don't have a formula for anything. There was a time maybe when I used to be very specific in the measurements. In general, you know, a lot of it is just by feel. A lot of it is having cut a few of these things. And in some instances, it's just taking a look at it and seeing that looks kind of iffy. And there's, like I said at the beginning, leaving this tenon is 4 inches long. It's actually 4 1/8 long. It's way longer than I actually need. So leave yourself some extra, and then you can trim it after the fact. As far as leaving some material on either side of it, you know, long grain is quite strong. So in the instance of the wedge we're about to create, there's only going to be about 3/16 of the material on either side of that wedge, which will be fine. You know, if you get thinner than that, you'll actually be able to flex those walls with just your fingers. That to me is too thin. So there's the formula. If I can flex it with my fingers, it's too thin. But this is another reason why working a Tusk tenon like this in thin material, it requires a lot of forethought. A lot of times when I see a Tusk tenon like this, it's like a trestle on a trestle table. I built a trestle table a few years ago, and it had big 12-quarter, 3-inch wide, 3-inch thick pieces. And I was able to drive, a huge wedge through there and not have to worry about splitting on me or giving out on me because I had so much wood to deal with. In the particular instance we're trying to address here, somebody's trying to build this type of knockdown joinery with 4/4 stock. So, well, let's just get into it. Let's go ahead and lay out this mortise square. And we need a reference edge here. Let's call this our reference edge. And let's say first wall. Second wall. And this is my reference face. Just need to set my mortise gauge again. Bring things out a little closer. Ooh, Cecil County, Old Line Workshop. What's going on up there? That's God's country up there. I love Cecil County. This is a little bit harder to set because I've already cut my shoulder out. What I should have done is kept the setting when I actually laid out and saw this mortise in the first place, but I wasn't thinking. So you're just asking to introduce error at this point. Oh, what am I doing? All I have to do is get the spacing right, and then I'm setting the fence. Oh, it shouldn't be that bad. Okay. Okay, so now I need to transfer my lines around. Just like I did on the first mortise. Like that's it. I don't know why I just went over the pencil sharpener. Pencil sharpener right there. Just darken these in so you guys can hopefully see them better. So now I'm going to bore this out. So I need a hold fast here, but it won't hurt. Now, where is that auger bit? Oh, shoot, put it away. See, this is like the reverse of the Roy Underhill syndrome, where Roy just sets his tools down and they pile up all over the bench. Me, I'm trying to like be fastidious and put them away, and I actually need that bit that I had in here prior. So there's number 11. I specifically laid that bit out before I went live because I knew that I would need it. Because it matches the thickness of the tenon that we have on this thicker board here. Well, hello, Joshua from Colorado. That's what I still call home. Went to college in Colorado, went to high school in Colorado. Love Colorado. All right, what am I doing here? All right. So in this case, I want to line my mortise up. And again, just feeling for the point to pop through on the other side. Go to the opposite end. Just this little bit in the middle. I actually wonder if it is just faster to go ahead and chop it through when you're dealing with such soft wood like pine. But hey, I'm all about showing different ways to do things, because that's one thing you'll learn in woodworking. There's 100 ways to do the same thing. And they're all right. There's no right or wrong as long as you're not hurting anybody or yourself. Now, when the lead screw pops through, it stopped pulling the bit through, so it just kind of freewheels. And you can apply pressure down to kind of force the whole thing through, but I find that that ends up causing more trouble than not, especially in a soft wood like this. So when it stops cutting, and it's just kind of spinning right now, instead of pressing down, I'm going to rock it. And what that's doing is actually causing those spurs on the side to just sever cleanly. These little cutting spurs that outline the perimeter of the hole, they are now doing their job and just severing the wood away. Otherwise, you just risk blowing things all to hell and it gets ugly. When we're talking about a through mortise and tenon, that's a big deal. You want a nice, pretty surface. Somebody call my cameraman and tell him he's late. Whatever he did for a cameraman. Now, pare these walls back. I'm not going all the way through. Well, that time I did a little bit. And arg, I don't have a chisel. Oh, I don't have a chisel that matches this width. That was poor planning on my part. That's all right. I will deal with it. Call my favorite antique tool dealer and say, hey, do you have any 5/8" chisels? Not that I really need them all that often, but I need one right now. So, isn't that how it's supposed to work? You're supposed to buy tools as you need them? Where were you last night? I needed a 5/8" chisel. Really, I think the reason that's never come up is I generally plan my joinery around my available tooling. That's what happens when you lay all this stuff out on the fly at 5 o'clock this evening. What fun would it be if all of our tools perfectly matched all the joinery? What kind of challenge is that? Okay, I'm going to stand back a little bit here, because one of the things with a through mortise like this is I certainly want that wall to be square. So if I stand behind it, I can see that I am straight up and down. You see, it really doesn't take a lot of effort when I'm working not only cross-grain, but cross-grain and pine. But I actually have, I think, a little bit more control using the mallet here than I would just using hand pressure. Kind of like the same thing with carving. You know, you can track a line with that V-gouge a little bit better if you can just take nice light taps with the mallet. I can really choke up on this mallet and control how much force I'm exerting. Alright, let's see if that fits. Where's my tooth whacker? A little bit caught the edge there. Let's see if we can salvage that. So on this side, the corner actually caught the edge and it kind of blown the edge out a little. It's not the end of the world because it's still there. I can actually glue that back in place. But you've got to be careful about that. I should have double checked before I went after that. Actually, I think I'm a little bit proud of my work. That's why it's sticking out. So I wasn't. Did I not? Maybe I didn't pair from that side because it looks like I still have a little bit of material left right in the corner. There we go. Huh, that looks better. And it comes up tight on the other side. Now, this is what I started doing that I screwed up before. I have to actually lay the wedge in place, but I haven't created the wedge yet. And there's a reason why I didn't do that, because it's kind of fortuitous that it worked out this way. But if you look at the grain on this piece, you can see how it's angling down like that. Well, that looks like about the angle I want to go with. That's what we're going to do. We're just going to adopt that angle. Oh, if only we were so lucky. No, it's not going to split like I want it. That's fine. Straight edge. Let's work. That. Sharpie is about dead. But it's cool the way this grain is running. I'm actually going to have the wedge follow that grain, so essentially I'll end up with a stronger wedge. Maybe. We'll see. Square my line across. Saw that out. Let me do that. Yeah, it's almost long enough. Get us close. Go. Now I need to just plane that flat. Let's just put a flat plane for that. one wedge. Just double check that we're square across. So there is my wedge. I can make it prettier later if I really wanted to, but no need to do that right now. All right, so now I can lay out the mortise. And this time, let's go ahead and just mark. That's going to be the top. So same thing as before. I'll lay this in place and figure, okay, that looks kind of nice there, and let's slide it up just a little from there, maybe 1/8 of an inch or so. And there is the, you know what? I'm going to do it. I'm even going to go, let's just add a shortcut. Instead of right there where it's up a little bit more, I'm going to slide it up even further. And that line that I just marked, you guys probably can't see that. Let me zoom in a little. Focus. So that line that I just marked, it's about, we'll say, a little heavy of a 1/16. There's a gap between them. I'm going to mark the line there. And now, that offset that I created before to really get it to wedge up tight, that's now my offset. I know what that is that's going to be. So I can take that distance and I can slide back and mark that face. Pop it out of the mortise and we just measure that. What is that offset that I just created? Seconds. Oh yeah, it's a 1/16 of an inch. So, come over here, mark a 1/16 of an inch offset. Now, transfer this line around, just like I did before. Where's my double gauge? All right, so here we come in and set. Whoa, too close. Back it up. Set my double gauge to whatever that angle is. And again, just so I don't get it mixed up, I won't move the board, I'll just move the square underneath. Now I can move the board and I can feel confident that I've got, well, except that I need to transfer my lines across the edge. Try this again. Got an angle, flip it over. And ideally, if I connect this line squared across, it connects up with my other face. So that tells me I got it right. So now I've got the mortise laid out. This is the mortise that matches this wedge. So I need to reset my gauge to the thickness of the wedge. Remind me the next time I do one of these to not do 2 different joints. There's just not enough time. I want this to be an hour. What are we? Hour and 15? Yeah, we'll be done in the next 5 minutes. Okay. So the mortise is now set, mortise gauge rather, is now set to the thickness of wedge, and I just want to approximately center it on the tenon. Making sure I mark off the same face. Now, I gotta chop that out. Except I'm gonna bore it out. So this is the same activity or exercise here. I've got my lines laid out, and in this particular instance, boy, they're too tight. You really want to have good lighting. I'm not working in the most optimal conditions here because everything is backlit. I've got film lights, so you guys can see, which is throwing all of my work kind of in backlight. But you want to be able to see the angle that you've created, that you marked out on the board. And it's really just a matter of lining up by eye. You may get a little intimidated because, oh my God, now we're having to board angles and match angles and things like that. And that's the real beauty of the wedge, is the tighter, the more you drive it in, the tighter the whole thing's going to get. And if the angle is not exact, it's still going to come up snug. Now, will it come up more snug if the angle's right and the wall of the mortise is flat? Absolutely, but certainly not the end of the world if you come up a little bit off your angle. That feels out about halfway through. And we come down to the other end. I want to get as close to my line as possible. And we get it started. And then angle it over. And if you want, you can grab your bevel gauge that you set before, and you can kind of line it up and just double check, but usually just sighting down. I mean, you've got this nice long straight bit here, so just match that angle by eye. Should I plumb the other direction? Yeah, we're good. Okay, it's a little more than halfway, but I took that one to the point which is poking at the other side because, well, if I don't try to replicate the angle in the other face, you know, there's always that human error that you can throw into the mix, and it's just better to try to go all the way through. Now I'm just removing the junk in the middle. Doesn't really matter the angle here. Just want to hog out waste. Hey Garth, how are you? When'd you get here? Alright, so now we're going to bore the rest of the way through. That was easy. It's always a good sign you did it right when it meets up nicely. Okay, now I'm boring the opposite angle. Man. Where's my phone? A little bit of light. Okay. Making sure I'm looking at the right line here. Now I shouldn't have to go very deep here. Nope, and I met up. Perfect. A few on that. Not around on me because there's just not enough material here. Fine. So now I need to chop all of that out. Hey, Jeff is here. Hey, Jeff. Using your mallet, buddy. Why move the angled front line back? Are you really concerned that it's the back of the mortise or the inside of the pine board? Aren't you just making the size of the exposed mortise smaller? Technically, yeah. But there's also the positioning of the wedge. Yes, what I'm doing is making it smaller, and what that does is prevent me from driving this down too far. So if I move it back, I could just leave my original line, and that just makes the mortise wider, which means I just drive it down a little bit further to take up the slack. Because the further I drive it down, the wider that gets. But there's also some aesthetics in here. Because this is a visible joint, and a lot of people look at it, getting it so that it comes up tight when it's kind of aesthetically where you want it is just as much part of the equation as getting it to come up tight. So if it comes up tight down like this, yeah, that may look okay, but does it look as cool as it does like that? I don't know. I mean, that's up to you. But I've also seen many instances on like Pennsylvania Dutch furniture from the 18th century and 19th century. Well, they'll do like chip carving up here. And Jeff, you're a chip carver, so you want to do this. They'll do like a little like hex sign chip carving. Well, if that is now partially hidden inside the mortise, well, that doesn't look good. So you need to create the width of that mortise so that it also determines the lateral, not lateral, but the vertical placement of this wedge when it comes up tight. And that's why I'm moving it back to create that drawbar effect, and I need to subsequently move the front wall back to match. Hope that makes sense. Cannot overstate the wonder of hanging on to your offcuts. So here, I need to chop through, right? Well, that would cause a little bit of problems. Take my offcut, slide it underneath, and ta-da! I now have perfect custom fit support. Because I'm chopping, even though I don't have to chop that part here, I really don't want to keep this in the vise. It will just slip down as I try to chop my way down. Need quarter-inch chisel. Poor planning. Where's my other chisel? I'm missing a chisel. Oh, put the chisel back in the wrong spot. I say I'm looking for my 3/8" chisel and I can't find it. It's because I put it back in the 1" chisel spot. So this here again, really helpful to have the wedge stock actually matching the width of your chisel. The less kind of doubling up you have to do with your strokes, just the more accurate you're going to be in the long run. Knock these little raised bits down. working across the grain is really easy. The keys here are to get this wall on the line in vertical. Too wide. This wall, set it on my line, let's get it to bite. Now I'm going to lean it back and just sight down here and eyeball that angle. I don't want to go too deep just yet. It's because I've got this extra kind of schmutz in here from the remnants of the holes that I bored. And if I wedge too much, if I try to wedge the chisel in here too much, I can split the board apart. So I've got to go a little delicately at first. Hey Jeff, if you're listening, what someone needs to create is a mallet that's awesome, like this, for chopping, and then one that I can use to unseat my holdfast. Because I don't want to just turn around and whack. I mean, I suppose it wouldn't hurt to hit my metal holdfast with this, but it grates on my nerves, like fingernails on a chalkboard to go clinging against it like that. So I'm constantly reaching for this Home Depot special to unseat the mallet, or the holdfast. Technically, a wooden mallet will work like that, but just using a wooden mallet on these holdfasts just tears it up. So somehow we need to create like a Darth Maul looking double bladed thing that you can just kind of tap and then look around. The problem is it would look ugly. So I'll let you figure that out as the mallet designer. Anybody that doesn't know, Jeff Fleischer is Shenandoah Toolworks. This is made by Shenandoah Toolworks. Jeff, I expect a check in the mail. I don't even know if he's still in the chat room. Ray Bartlett, why couldn't you flatten? Oh, you're asking Garth or you're asking me? You say, why couldn't I flatten what? I can flatten anything you want. Let's go ahead and chop the angled wall first. Again, I don't want to drive too deep just yet. I'm going to make sure I get all the waste out of there. Get this extra stuff out of here. Once I've got some room in this mortise, I can then connect those lines. But until then, I'm just a little leery of wedging a chisel in and having the extra waste that's in the way, like wedge apart my tenon. Go through. Grab Then you dig some stuff out of here. Okay, now some room to work with here. See, without that support, it wants to leave things loose. And through. Come on. Just some stuff right in the center here that's gumming up the works. Let's grab a wire and chisel and just pair those walls. Move the hump in the middle. Okay, so hold up the light a little so I can see the little fuzzies inside. I think, where'd my wedge? Where'd my wedge go? Oh, blends in. I'm going to chamfer this bottom edge. So I don't unintentionally blow out the mortise or catch it, catch the corner or something as the wedge comes through. Plus I would do this anyway, just as a kind of a decorative feature, if you will. And it's not a bad idea to just break the irises on the mortise or the wedge in general. It will certainly ease the passage of the whole thing. It's a little tight. Let me do a little bit more pairing. Yeah, I've got a little bit of a hump right there. You got to be careful here. This is where I could possibly, split the thing by driving. I don't want to wedge across the grain, I want to wedge along the grain. You know what? I can also make this a little bit easier on myself. It's a little bit tight, so let's reduce the thickness of the wedge ever so slightly. So I can certainly continue to mess around with the mortise. There's a little fat spot right there. But also just hitting that wedge. I don't want to take too much more off the wedge. just because it's fitting nicely at the top here. It's just getting hung up on a little lump in the middle. There we go. Now that's sliding through the way I want it. Slip the wedge in place. And let's draw it up tight. Hear that pitch change? That's firm. And there we go. That is now wedged in place, and you can see it's a little bit higher because of that offset, but you know, I really suggest keeping it tight and letting it kind of sit for a week, and then come back and tap those wedges again. And I guarantee you'll go down another 1/8, if not 1/4 of an inch. If it still doesn't go down the way you want it, then you can just very easily, as Jeff was saying, come back and just widen that mortise a little bit. Just come down and pare a little bit away from the mortise, or you can even pare a little bit away from the tenon. In fact, it's probably easier. Come back and take a couple plane passes on the wedge itself, and then it will sink down a little bit more. But right now, I mean, this is as strong as any drawboard joint I've ever felt. This is definitely not coming apart with hand pressure. And you apply some finish to that, you've got even a little bit more tooth, even a little bit more friction on the whole thing, and it is dead stable. So let's reassemble the other one. So something's wrong here. Up the other way. I didn't mark this piece. I marked the other one. Okay, and we have created a Rube Goldberg machine. Now the real challenge for next month's live shop update will be to turn this into a piece of furniture. What do we make with a double-wedged dealie? So let's do a little post-mortem here. Some of this is appearance. Now granted, I think this wedge just looks prettier because I put more effort into it, but it's a totally different look, right? You know, it looks this way, you know, it looks okay. It looks really cool this way with it running vertical. This wedge, not so much this way, but it definitely looks better running vertical. Now again, the wedge needs some attention just to shape it and make it look a little bit prettier. But I find this version is super, super strong. Look at all the bearing surface I've got here. I've got this long wedge. It's running along the shoulder. It's running up against the mortise piece. So all of this is force that's preventing it from coming apart. And I can use a much longer angle. This one, you saw just how slight the taper was because it's only across the thickness of the tenon. So it still does a really good job, but there's not nearly as much bearing surface. So this is my preferred method when I've got, when I need a really structural joint that's holding, you know, a case together. In this particular case, the listener was putting together a crib. This would definitely be something for the long rails that I want to hold it together. This is much more, you know, it's definitely tight, it's knockdown joinery, but is it going to be as strong? I don't think so. It's still pretty dang strong. I mean, just a good fit on the mortise is where you got to start. If that is not a good fit and it's sloppy, it's not going to work as well. Drawbars can help fix a sloppy fit. This will still slide around on you. So it's definitely one of those things where you need to weigh the options, and you also need to weigh the aesthetics. As I said, this looks cooler than that, and vice versa. That looks kind of silly, you know, but that looks awesome. This is the joint that I've used for my spring pole lathe. And you want to talk about dynamic forces. The whole thing's rocking around as you're stepping on the pedal. It does not budge. And in fact, it even seats even stronger in use to the point where I got to really wallop on those wedges to get them to come back out. So in that particular instance, I had hard maple and teak actually for the cross members, and white oak for the wedges. Again, I don't think the species is as big of a deal, but a nice hard species like that is certainly going to deform less than you would see with the pine that we have here. So there's my demonstration for today. Any other questions before we call it a night? Hey, thanks, Garth. I'm glad you came out, and I'm glad you didn't know about that, because it is definitely my preferred method. And if you look, you can see it is tight around that tenon and tight at the bottom. And that's the real sign that you did it right, that you matched that angle. And you could feel it when you're driving it in, just how good a fit that is. See if I missed. Ray says, sorry if I missed, that wedge is a 1-to-7 slope. I have no idea, Ray. That wedge, the second wedge, was designed specifically to line up with that grain. You see how the grain mimics that angle? Again, I have no idea what the angle is. I rarely will measure that angle. What I'm looking for is a shallow angle. The example I used is a Morse tenon. Very shallow angle. This is even shallower. It's going to just be stronger and less of an opportunity that's going to come apart on you. Sorry to hear that, Bob, that the chisel was too loud. Okay. Any other questions here? All right, well, thanks for coming out, guys. Again, I post shop updates every Friday to my YouTube channel, to my blog. And once a month, I'm just going to go live. I may have a demo like I had in mind here. I may just open it for Q&A, but ultimately what I want to do is actually some work. I'd rather not just kind of stand around and answer questions and talk. I'd rather answer questions by showing you how I do it. So that's what you can look forward to in the future. Probably the first Thursday nights work well for me. First Thursday night of every month is when I'll be doing these things. So come back next month, or just pay attention to my blog, my YouTube channel. I'll certainly be announcing it the week before. I'll also be sending out emails if you're on the email list, notifying you that it's coming out, and if I have a topic, what that will be. So cool, guys. You guys have a great night, and have a great Friday tomorrow, and get in your shops this weekend and build some stuff. Cool. We will see you all next time, I guess. As soon as I find the stop button. Where's the stop button? How do you stop this thing? Hey, Jane, get me off this crazy thing.